Hey guys, today we are going to be learning APIs. This is Tamer from House of Code, and I'm going to show you the bare basics on how we can get a simple API set up so that way you can get started with your full stack web application or whatever your project may be. So, in this video, we are going to first learn what an API is and how we set one up, and then towards the end, we will actually start writing the code that it takes to set up our API. Now, we are going to be doing this in JavaScript, but don't worry, I do plan to release videos in the future and doing it for other programming languages as well. So, let's go ahead and get started here. First, what is an API? Well, an API, which stands for Application Programming Interface, is a set of defined protocols that allow applications and software to communicate with each other. They are all found across the web throughout many of our favorite apps, like YouTube, Netflix, Facebook, Twitter, etc. What do we use APIs for? Well, we use APIs to accept and approve requests. They are essentially the middleman between the front end and back end of a full stack web application. On the front end, we can submit a request with a payload, and this usually contains something like HTML form data, where we can then access it on the back end, utilize the data from the payload, and then we can return a response alongside an HTTP status code, like for example 201, 409, or 500. APIs are used for thousands of different things across the web. Some of the most common, though, are for account creation, authentication, file uploads, file retrieval, messaging and email services, and so much more. Here's an example of an API being used in some of the projects we could be working on. For an example, let's say I want to log in to my account on a website. Well, I just simply fill out the email username and password fields that the HTML form requires. Then, once I submit the form, my request will be sent off to the API containing my information in the form of a payload. Now, just a side note, this ideally should be encrypted with HTTPS, but the API will then execute some backend code that will communicate with the database to validate that my login information is correct. After that, the API will return a response alongside a status code approving or denying my login requests. And this can be in the form of a login being successful and rerouting us to the dashboard of our account, or just simply telling us that our email, username, or password is incorrect. Now, right here, I actually have an example that I made with Lucidchart. This is basically just a flowchart of how our API works. So here we have the front end where our HTML form or our login page exists. We enter our information, press login or submit, and then a request is made and it is sent to our API. And for our example, we would be sending it to the /login route. And then what happens is, in our API, our code will execute and create possibly an SQL query that compares the data that we entered to the data inside a database and checks for a record existing. If a record exists where the password and email match, then that means we have gotten our email and password correct. So we would just return a query result either containing the data sets that we wanted to retrieve, could be a user ID that we will later store in a JWT, or our query result can be null or zero, meaning that the login had failed. Either way, this query result will go back to our API, which we will later then send it back as a response saying success, we have logged in, or login failure, which can be an error 500, internal server error, or whatever error code you believe best fits that. So, very simple diagram on how our front end interacts with our API and then the back end. Now, keep in mind, we don't necessarily have to have a database here. This can also just be other back-end files, but usually in this case, we would just be communicating with an SQL database. or MongoDB if you prefer NoSQL. So what do requests and responses look like? Well, requests and responses can take many forms, but usually they are sent and returned as JSON or JavaScript object notation. Sometimes they can be plain text, GraphQL, HTML, XML, and many, many more. However, the most common is going to be JSON just because of how easy it is to use. So, what kind of request methods are made? Well, there are several request methods, and I believe right now there are actually 9. But some of these request methods include, but are not limited to, get, post, put, and delete. However, in most full stack web apps, you are usually working in get or post. However, don't be surprised if you ever have to work with others. So, the difference between get and post is pretty clear. Post is used to submit data to the server, but it usually alters the server state. So, this could be appending data to the database, removing it, or just however you are altering the backend. Get, however, is used to retrieve data from the server, hence the name get, and this usually will not alter the server state. So whenever we're using a GET request, we're not really going to be altering the database or anything on the server. We're just retrieving information and supplying the front end with said information. Lastly, let's talk about API frameworks. An API framework is a type of framework that follows specific guidelines for building APIs. REST is a popular example, which stands for Representational State Transfer. It is a type of API framework that simplifies the process of making APIs that follow REST principles. Some of these principles promote scalability, simplicity, and reliability. An API that follows these REST principles is usually called a RESTful API. Some popular RESTful API frameworks include FastAPI, Flask, and Django for Python, .NET Core for C#, and Express or Node for JS or JavaScript, and many more other frameworks across different programming languages like Java, PHP, C, etc. So now that we understand what an API is and how it works, let's go ahead and build our very first API, which we will be doing in Express JavaScript. So I will see you right in the IDE. Alright guys, so now we can go ahead and create our API. Now, as I said just a little bit ago in the video, we are going to be doing this in Express and Node, which is in JavaScript. So if you want to see how to do an API in any other language, don't worry, I do plan to in the future release videos on creating APIs in those other languages like Python, C#, etc. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, just so you guys are aware, we do need Node installed on our computer to do this. Don't worry, I do have a separate video where we get further in depth creating an API and actually connecting it with a front end. And in that video, I show you guys how to install Node as well. So if you're interested in that, be sure to give that video a watch as well. But let's go ahead and get started now. So the first thing we need to do is open our root folder for our API in a terminal. Oh, and just a side note, your root folder for your API should be in the same folder that your front-end folder is in. So for an example, if I have a folder called www, it should house the folder containing my API and the folder containing my front-end. That's just usually how we structure our full-stack projects. So now that we have our folder open in a terminal, we are going to type in npm init-y, and this is going to create a package.json file. And this is just going to contain the information about our app here. So we are going to make a simple change, and we're going to just change this to server.js instead of index. Now, does it really matter? No, it's more of just a preference thing, but usually we just call our main API source code just server.js. And by the way, you can do this in TypeScript as well. You are not just limited to JavaScript. So if you prefer to type checking and all that stuff, feel free to use TypeScript. It is the exact same way. But now we need to install Express. So npm I express, or you can just fully write out install instead of the letter I, and it will install 67 different packages. So, as you can see, we have a package lock.json, which is nothing important to us. It's just a whole bunch of information related to the packages we installed. So definitely don't want to do anything in here, otherwise you will mess up your project. But here we have our node modules folder, which if you've worked with node.js before, then you know what all this is, just where our packages are installed that Express needs. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and close out the terminal and create a new file. And we're going to call it, you guessed it, server.js. And in here, we can go ahead and start by typing in const express is equal to require express, and then const app is equal to express. Now, ideally, right here, you would also have cores installed, and then you would use cores to actually limit which port can access this API. And there you would add the port or the localhost and the port that your front end is running off of. So, for an example, let's say you have a React app with feet that uses port 5173. You would want to add localhost 5173 to the core's options to actually allow that side of the server to basically access our API while blocking all others. But that is something that we used in a different video, so we'll see that later on. But now we are going to type in app.use express.json, and then we can start writing what's called our endpoints. Now, our endpoints are basically just these URLs or routes that we can enter in the address bar to make a request and get a response. So we can type in app.get to make a get request. And then if we enter just a slash, all this is going to do is just, by default, if we don't specify a route, we'll just come here. And then it is as simple as request and response, usually just marked as rec and res. And then basically all we're making is a function that will execute code whenever we call this endpoint here. So here I could type in res.send and just something like hello world. And this is going to be sent as plain text, not JSON. So now it is app.use, app.listen. And in here is going to be a port number and then just a simple function that will run once we start this app. So, about this port number, you want to be very careful. Obviously, you don't want to use the ports for HTTP and HTTPS and SSH and all that stuff. Don't want to do that. But you also don't want to use the ports that are being actively used by other projects, like your front end. So, for React and Vite, we use port 7153, I believe. So, you do not want to use that for your API. It will not work. But we usually reserve port 8080 for APIs. Sometimes you might use other ports for it too, but from what I've seen most people use, it is usually just 8080. Then, empty brackets, and then here, we can just type in something like console.log server is running on HTTP localhost 8080. And that's basically it. So now if I go ahead and run, which by the way, to run it, it's just node and then server.js. Or if you have the runner extension, you can just use that as well. So let's actually go ahead and follow this link. And we get hello world. Now, what if I wanted to change this to something like goodbye world? Well, I can just simply do that, turn it off and run it again, and then refresh, and now we have goodbye world. So, see, all I have to do is just enter in localhost 8080, and then it defaults to this endpoint here, because I have not specified anything. So, if I wanted, let's just change this back real quick. If I wanted to change this to say hello, and I were to run, well, turn it off first, and then run it again. By the way, there's an actual package we can install that does this for us. It's called NodeMon. And if I were to go ahead and refresh, we'll get this error here, cannot get, which is basically 404. So, what can I do then? Well, I just have to type in say hello up here, and then I get my response, hello world. Pretty simple. Alright, let's do another get method. So app.get, let's actually kill this real quick. And here we are going to just type in fruits. And then it is request and response. And then here. So now we're actually going to send some JSON. And it looks like Copilot here is already suggesting what to add. So we'll just click tab and do it. But it is simply res.send and then an array. But actually I did it wrong. So what we can do is we can just type in a set of curly braces, and then we can type in fruits, and then we can type in apple, banana, cherry. And yeah, that's about it. So if I go ahead and run this one more time, come here, go to fruits. As you can see, I now get returned a JSON response, and it's going to contain the array fruits containing my apple, banana, and cherry. Pretty cool. Alright, let's talk about post now. So, app.post. And we'll just call this login or something. Now, I don't have a front end set up for this, but if we wanted to grab the form data from our HTML form on the front end and then send it through this API endpoint, we would just type in const and then let's say email and password, and then we would send it equal to rec.body. And then we would be able to access it by just typing in email and password and then getting the text content of those. And ideally, we would run it through a function that checks if the account exists in a database. And if so, we'll return a JWT, which is a JSON Web Token, which don't worry, future video coming out on that. And then that's how we would authenticate and such. So that's how posts would work. And of course, in the end, we'll do res.json, send in a status code like 201, which I believe is success, or 500 for internal server error, and stuff like that. So that's how posts would work. Again, I don't have a front end to actually show you guys this, but I promise this is basically how we would obtain the data, and then we can do whatever we need to do with it. So, pretty simple. That's API for you guys. Very simple API, very easy to get running. At minimum, with just one simple endpoint that just says hello world, this is really just 12 lines of code, or 9 without the spaces. So very easy to write. It does, of course, get harder as you go on and as your API gets more complex. And with that, if you want to learn more about APIs and actually how to set it up with a front end in React through Axios, be sure to check out my other video, just located up there. This way. Yep, that way. Sorry, my webcam's mirrored. But be sure to check out that video too. In that video, I show you guys not only how to make an API, but also how to make a React project, and how we can then link our API to our front end. So that way, instead of just viewing the raw JSON that we were just viewing, we would instead view it on an actual HTML page. And yep. So again, that's simple APIs. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video and would like to see more just like it, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave me a comment. It boosts engagement and also gives you a chance to let me know what you might want to see next time. I do read our comments, guys, and I do follow through with most of these comments that I get. So if there's something you would like to see, please let me know. I would definitely love to make a video on it if I can. Also, be sure to join my Discord server. We have a new and improved House of Code website coming very soon, and that's where I post updates for it, as well as uploads as well. So if YouTube doesn't notify you good enough, I will through Discord. So be sure to join our Discord community. We are trying to reach 1,000 members by the end of this year. And without further ado, you guys have a wonderful day and happy coding.